My name is Lamothe, and I'm a principal at Mission High School, and I'm here just to welcome you. I'm so happy that you're here. I can't imagine how exciting this is. I'm excited about the work that you're going to do, and I'm really excited that it's happening in this space because I think you bring some energy that can only mean good things for the children who go to school here. So I want to thank you for coming out this very chilly Saturday morning. And I will share just a quick story with you that's sort of an expression that helps to illustrate my appreciation for you being here this morning. About 2 years ago, I had an intern. This was someone who was going through a principal licensure program. And we were talking about testing and assessment, talking about a lot of the things that brought me here this morning. And she said to me, so if you don't use the district assessments, the standardized tests is what she was referring to, and you don't put a lot of weight on the state standardized tests, then how do you know that kids are learning? And I said to her, well, you know, all this really hasn't been around all that long. And so I said, so how did you know this before coming to the program? She was a teacher. I said, so how did you know your students were learning before all this came about? She didn't have any. And so I thought, wow. I mean, that said a lot about that particular preparation program. It said a lot about future preparation programs. It also said a lot about what this past 15 years or so has done to the experience of educators and what they know. There's this big gap in understanding how to know what other people understand and learn and know how to do. There's this big gap in seeing people as full people. And in all the talk about crisis in America, I haven't really heard that named as one of them, and it couldn't be more clear. And so what I'm really excited about in terms of your connection with each other today is that you're going to help undo some of that work that's been happening and growing over the past 15, 20 years. If we're including IQ testing, it's even longer. So what my hope is for you is that as you learn and grow and share today, that you're going to take that and connect that with somebody else who's not here today. Because I'm hoping there'll be fewer and fewer people who are part of that gap in understanding the fullness and richness of human diversity in general. And this work is a slice of that really, really powerful and essential work that needs to be done. So thank you for being here. I'm going to lay that super heavy charge on you and just walk away. But I think the whole day is going to kind of be about that. And it certainly doesn't end with today.
Thank you, Ayla.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. We're very happy to be here at the Mission Hill School. My name is Monty Neal. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Test, the National Center for Fair and Open Testing. This is our 30th year of trying to make assessment right for kids and teachers in schools and parents and communities as well. And in the last few years, we've begun to see some progress again, and at least the serious critique of the test. But it's important to think about better ways of assessing. And so that's why we have got together with some good allies to sponsor this conference today. And so among those key allies are Citizens for Public Schools, who's my colleague at Fair Test, Lisa Geisgon, who's also the executive director of Citizens for Public Schools. Lisa, say a few words.
Well, welcome. I'm also really excited about today. I turned on the radio in my car this morning and heard Bob Marley's Redemption Song, singing about emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, and I think we're going to be doing some of that today. CPS is also a 32-year-old organization advocating for public education, for the resources for public schools, and for quality and equity in education. Unfortunately, lately that means fighting against a lot of things like high-stakes standardized testing. We have a Less Testing, More Learning campaign, which has a petition. We have some bills filed in the Massachusetts legislature. We invite you all to come to our website, citizensforpublicschools.org, check out the bills, get involved. Join. We are a membership organization. We need you to join us so that we can build a strong movement to emancipate ourselves together and open space for the kinds of assessments that we're going to be learning about and talking about today. We also bring speakers. We're having Jonathan Kozol come speak in Wednesday, May 6th, and Lonnie Guinier, who has a new book out about the testography, is coming in the fall. So we're doing a lot of exciting things, but the more of you who join us, the more exciting it'll be. So thank you for coming today.
And another of our group that put this together is the Boston Teachers Union, and we have Jessica Tang, organizer extraordinaire from the BTU, here with us. Jessica?
So we're really thrilled to partner with Monty from Fair Test and Lisa from CPS and Alan Jayland and Paul Tritter, the Director of Professional Learning at the BTU, have really been working on this for months to put this together. And so we know that as we talk to our educators, over-assessments and the misuse of assessments has really been problematic at taking time away from teaching and learning. We know if you just test students, that doesn't actually help them to learn. We actually have to teach for them to learn. And so as a former teacher at the Young Achievers School, we did portfolio assessments. I know that there are lots of really rich and authentic, actually even more rigorous ways to assess our students, but sometimes that conversation is lost, as Principal Gavins had mentioned. And so this conference is important to show that there are better ways to assess our students and make sure that they're learning. It's not to say we shouldn't have assessments. We know that they're important, but we need to make sure that they're appropriate and that they're not misused. And so we hope that you are inspired by today to continue advocating for this work. I think a work of educators is not just to teach, but also to advocate for what we know our students need. And we hope that you will continue to do that with us. If you're a BTU member, we have a Less Testing, More Learning committee. We've been working on advocacy on this issue for a couple years. Ryan is one of the co-chairs of that committee. If you have questions, you should definitely ask her, or me, or Paul, or Angela Christians, our political director, is also here. And we're working with the state and city and however we can, and our partners to make sure that our students are getting what they need and are properly assessed. So thanks so much.
And Jessica mentioned Paul Tritter in the back and Alan, who just went back out to the registration. That's sort of our core group to put this together, but we also want to thank the other co-sponsors, the Student Alliance Young, which helped spread the word about this, and they've been an inspiration. Lisa and I have been working with them for the last year and a half, 2 years, and they've been an inspiration to us. The Mass Teachers Association, I know there's folks in the Mass Teachers Association here. They've also spread the word about this, and we're happy to be working with them. MTA is involved with CPS, and we're all kind of tied in together here. And then the Teacher Action Group also, of activist teachers in the Boston area, have co-sponsored. I want to thank the Nellie Mae Foundation. They're the reason why this conference is free. I'm joking that we had 100 registrants, and we see who's already here, and we should have charged money because then you would have felt you had to get out of bed in the morning. But we thought with this nice donation from Nellie Mae, we could provide lunch and do it for free. So we thank them as well. You'll notice there's video going on. Bob and Yvonne Lamothe are here. videoing. They will turn this into videotapes that will be available on the internet for you. If you have any problem, any desire not to get filmed, please tell them if they're filming in the session. Now, the workshops. The workshops are all up on the second floor. We've put some signs around to help you get to the rooms because it's a long building. And so at one end down there, you have the library and one of the other rooms, and then way at the other end you have more rooms, and there's still more down what they call the gold corridor in between. We put some signs up. I'm sure you can find them all. With the small numbers, we'll see who comes in the next 15, 20 minutes. And at the end of the keynote, we may talk a little about juggling some of the workshops for the day, because some will be repeated morning and afternoon, and some are just morning and some are just afternoon. We're going to do something right after lunch called Free Space. And Paul here from the BTU and BPS, another two-hatted person, will give us a couple words on what the free space is to look like.
Yeah, so just after lunch, we're going to have a session called Open Space Technology. It's a fancy name for something that's not fancy at all, which is basically people who are interested in exploring a topic, presenting on a certain issue, or just having a conversation about something, can just off the cuff hold a little impromptu conversation. So as you go through the keynote and the morning workshop, if there's something that pops into your mind, either that you'd like to share with someone, maybe it's some of your work or something that you've done, or a question that comes to mind that you'd like to discuss with people and explore, we're going to do that just after lunch. And we'll have a space during lunch to write down things that you might be interested in learning about, and maybe there'll be someone here who knows about it who can facilitate the conversation with you. So we'll have more details about that at lunch, but just keep priming the pump of your mind and thinking about the things that are interesting and that are grabbing your attention, and we'll get together some nice conversations about those after lunch.
I think lunch will be very good. We have a good lunch, including vegan options and all the rest of it, so we hope everybody will be happy with lunch. So we're looking forward to a very interesting day. I assume people have noticed that if you needed it, right out in the hall here, right up one other level, and on the second floor, plenty of bathrooms. So you shouldn't have any trouble finding a restroom when you need one, which may be one of the more important things of the day. We know that. So I think that's all the housekeeping that we need. So I want to take a couple minutes here why we organize this conference, which you've already begun to touch on. We think that assessments are critical because assessments are of learning, for learning, and they can be learning. We know about them mainly as the standardized tests. They're of learning. They give you information at the end, except they don't give you much information. And then when they're high stakes, they distort the teaching and the learning. But assessments done well can tell you a lot about what people, students, have learned. They also are a process of feedback. Formative assessment, assessment for learning, where information goes not only to the teacher to help guide her work with the students, but to the students themselves as and able to help them self-reflect and think about their strengths, their interests, where they need improvement, and what to do next. And then the kind of assessments we're talking about today are assessments that are themselves learning. Nobody that I know really thinks a test prep for the MCAS is much learning. But the kind of work that's done at the consortium, New York Consortium, and the schools who are presenting today, these kind of projects and tasks, they are themselves a learning activity. So you combine the learning, the feedback loops, and at the end, something to talk about where the student has got to. So that complex array, and if done well, it's about the things that really are important that engage the student. We'll hear a lot about student-directed processes here. They're tied to the curriculum. They're rooted in the curriculum. They're not rooted in abstractions called standards, but in the curriculum. And they provide real information to parents, much richer information. There's studies been done that found when we do performance assessments, parents are much more interested in that than they're ever interested in standardized test scores. And in fact, they can provide information to the community, as the New York Consortium will tell us the kind of information that they provide to the larger community. So, what we know at this time is that across the country, parents, teachers, students are rising in rebellion against the testing regime. The state itself said 67,000 parents, 67 kids were opted out by their parents in grades 3 through 8 in New York State in the math test, and nearly 50,000 in the language arts test last spring. This fall, thousands of students in New Mexico, high school students, walked out on the standardized testing just weeks ago. And in the fall, thousands walked out in Colorado. Teachers over the last 2 years in Seattle, 2 schools in Chicago, several schools in New York City have simply refused to administer the tests. There are thousands of people opting out, and it's growing rapidly. Meanwhile, school boards are passing resolutions, community forums are being held all over the place. There's a lot of organizing going on in dozens of states, building a movement to change this. But a critical question is, how do we know the kids are learning if we don't do tests? Well, the kids do lots of work. That's the first obvious answer. And if you're not paying attention to it, frankly, I would be nervous as a parent, and now I'm a grandparent, but I'd be nervous about what's going on in the classroom if the teacher can't figure out from the kids' work what the kids know. But that's the kind of de-skilling and erasure of knowledge we're seeing. So we want to deepen that, to reclaim it, but to significantly strengthen it. Not just same old, let's do some worksheets, as too often happened to me as a kid, I can assure you. So it's not new. But we want deep and rich learning. And what I'm pleased about today is we're going to have a chance to talk about the deep and rich learning. So with that, let me introduce our keynoters, our honored guests who came here to us from New York City. And I'm very, very happy they did. The New York Performance Standards Consortium is now 40-some schools, most in New York City. They will tell you some of the details about those schools. I am not. I will tell you that this started before No Child Left Behind, when they had a progressive education commissioner, state commissioner, Tom Sobel. And so they got started. Then they had to fight for their survival for a long time with the next superintendent, commissioner, who didn't want it, Rick Mills. And they organized. They are also excellent organizers. And they beat the powers that be in the state of New York, survived, thrived, and are now expanding. They do amazing work with amazing results. Now, I've known Ann Cook, the director of the consortium, for many years. She's on the Fair Test board. And every time I talk to Ann, I learn something. I'm very happy that I can work with her. Avram Barlow is a history teacher at Urban Academy, which Ann was a co-founder of. Is one of the schools in the consortium. And Avram, I've had the pleasure of beginning to know a little bit. Been on a panel with him. Again, every time I talk to him, something I learn. And really, for me, the height of this, 4 students, graduates at Urban Academy, now in college, have taken some weekend time to join us. And Gemma Venuti, I heard last summer at a conference in DC, and she blew me away. But just this morning, I met the other students for the first time. And now I have actually written their names down here, I hope. Because, yes. So, more or less in alphabetical order. Suhailer Booker, Elliot Garcia, and Anna Negron. And they will talk to you more about who they are, what they do, and how this works. So please welcome them to the stage. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. I know everybody's sitting with their coats on, so try to make this a heated discussion. So I hope we can keep this informal. Keynote is a bit of a kind of formal term, and I hope we don't just talk at you. I would like to try to do this in a kind of more interactive way. I know we're going to have workshops, but there's some of you who will be at other workshops, so hopefully we'll do a kind of short presentation, and then I hope we can open it up. I think the questions will be more helpful to people. Let me just give a little bit of background. Monty happened to talk a bit about good fortune to have a progressive commissioner at one time, a long time ago. We had a guy named Tom Sobel who was the commissioner during the early 90s. And just by way of background, you know, sometimes you don't know what's going to develop, how things are going to turn out. But Tom had an initiative which he called Compact for Learning. And he identified some schools that he thought were doing a reasonably good job, and he tried to team them up with some schools in the state that were struggling, and have them work with those schools, have those successful schools or better, more successful schools work with some schools that were struggling. And one of the things that we pointed out to him was that some of the schools that were identified as being successful had developed some ways of accountability, some methods of accountability that weren't dependent on tests. And he was kind of intrigued by that. And before he left office, Deborah Meyer, who's the founder of Mission Hill, and a number of the schools in the city, prepared a document which he then signed into as a regulation for the state of New York, Department of Education, which created the opportunity for some secondary schools to use a system of assessment that came to be called performance-based. He realized, I think, that the state isn't always, once he left, that he couldn't guarantee what would happen. And so he put a little clause in. The way the regulation read, it said that these schools ought to be able to develop this performance assessment system, and they should do it every year. There should be a kind of formative study, but at the end of 5 years, the state should do a summative study of whether this approach was successful. And then he added a little clause. He said, if the state doesn't do the summative study at the end of 5 years, I think bureaucrats know things about what states will and won't do. That should not be the reason to stop this, that should carry on. So the fact that the state did or didn't do their summative study shouldn't be the reason why the whole thing ended. And sure enough, town left, and after 5 years, the state had not done any kind of study. And we, as Monty mentioned, we had to turn ourselves into a more proactive group of parents and teachers and administrators and students. At one point, we delivered 1,400 bodies to Albany to talk to the legislators and talk to the Board of Regents about why these schools that were using this particular approach were successful and why they should keep it going. And in the end, by 1998, the state of New York had embarked on a standards-based approach, which was test-driven and which was going to end up becoming a 5 Regents exams passed at a certain score in order to graduate. And that is the way it is today for most of the schools in the state of New York. It's a high-stakes exit testing system. Students must pass 5, and that's everybody, including special ed kids, must pass 5 Regents exams with a score of 65 in order to get a high school diploma. So that's pretty high stakes. This group of schools that became known as the consortium challenged that. We've been in court, we've had blue ribbon panels, we've had many conversations with the commissioner, and we started with a couple of dozen schools. We're now at 48. And as Monty mentioned, most of them are in the city. And that isn't because there aren't other districts across the state that are interested. There are many schools and many districts that are interested in becoming part of the consortium or doing a variation of what the consortium does. But the regents control the numbers, and so we are constantly in a conversation with the members of the Board of Regents and the State Ed Department. And that's, of course, become more and more of an issue as time has gone on. Now, there's certain things that we've said all along. One thing we've said all along is that even though the state has this system of testing, our feeling is you can't do both systems and do them well. You can do 2 systems if you, particularly kids who are not seriously academically challenged, they can figure out how to take the tests and pass them, not necessarily with high grades, high grades, certainly not as high grades as schools that would be focused on the Regents. But if there are kids who are in most of the schools, it'd be extremely difficult to do what the consortium demands and also do the tests. And we can talk more about why that is, but I think we have a lot of experience as new schools have come in. We have added schools, and the schools that we've added have all been schools that started off as Regents test schools. So they've had a lot of experience trying to do the testing and also to try to bring the school into a more performance-based environment. Let me just say a bit about what the system is that we've designed. It consists of a minimum of 4 tasks that students, and the tasks mirror the areas, the disciplines that the Regents exams also require. So students in all of the schools, and I have to say something about the schools that we have are extremely diverse. As a group of schools, we have a more challenged population than the city of New York. So we have more kids in poverty, more kids who are L students percentage-wise, more kids who are special needs kids. We have the same, approximately the same or a little bit more kids of color, Hispanic and African American. And we get the same budget that we're public schools. We are not charter schools. We are New York City, New York State public schools subject to the rules and regulations of our particular districts. So except for the issue of the assessment, which is a state-driven system, we are in every other way like the New York City or New York State public schools. So we're not special schools in any kind of way other than the fact that there are a range of schools. So we have, in our consortium, we have 8 schools that are transfer schools. Those are schools that students come to after they've been at another high school. And either the high school experience hasn't worked for them there or the schools haven't wanted them there. It's a combination of lots of things. But they're transfer schools. There are 5 schools that are covered by the full waiver that are only L students. So all of the students in those 5 schools have been in the country less than 4 years and have failed what in New York State is called the NICESLAT, which is the English proficiency test. So probably the only schools you get into by failing a test. So there are 5 of those schools. There are schools that are some of the most impoverished districts in the country, the South Bronx. There are schools that have approximately 25 to 35% of their student body are classified as special needs. So it's a very, I hate to say, typical group of schools, but it is in almost every way. In fact, in certain respects, for example, the entering scores at the 8th grade level that are the citywide Regents exams that kids would take at the 8th grade level, the students entering these consortium schools have in the aggregate score below the city average. So they enter high school behind if you were to use the standardized scores. So keep that in mind when in a few minutes I'll give you some data on the outcomes. I want to say a little bit about what it is that we call our system of assessment. We have 4 tasks, which, as I said, mirror the requirements for the areas of the Regents exams in history, English, social studies, and science. Students are required across the consortium to do what we call PBATs, performance-based assessment tasks, in each of those disciplines. And then schools add on their own individual requirements. So, for example, some schools add on creative arts, some schools add on art criticism, some schools add on a second language, some schools add on internships as a requirement for graduation from that particular school. But across the consortium, every student in all our schools has to complete the 4 tasks, and there are rubrics for each of those tasks that are used to grade the work, and that those rubrics are the same across the consortium. Every 2 years, the rubrics are in each subject are revised. So one year we do English and social studies, the next year we do science and math. And though Avram can talk a bit about what happens, because he's been in just recently been involved in looking again at the social studies rubrics. So that means that because all of the schools are using the same rubrics, same criteria to look at the work, moderation studies, which bring together teachers from all of the different schools and regrade the papers blind, they're not allowed to do their own. The papers they would be reading would be from all the different schools. They're organized in teams around their subject discipline. Those then that becomes our reliability indicators, because we're looking at the work across the schools. In terms of validity, we're looking at what happens in terms of outcomes. What happens to the kids? What are the graduation rates? What are the dropout rates? What are the college going rates? What are the college persistence rates? So we're looking at those issues in terms of outcomes. And we're also looking at things like incidents in the schools, what's the culture in the schools. I think, I'll say more about that in a minute. And what implications there are, what's the data look like for teacher retention, which people tend to equate teacher retention with stability in a school and the success of the students, so that we look at that as well. So that's the system. There's a tremendous amount of PD that goes on. There's professional development all the time, both that the consortium offers as well as individual schools. There's a huge amount of sharing. We just finished our annual conference where we bring together teachers from all the consortium schools, 700-800 teachers, and have workshops that are offered for the teachers, by the teachers, some 40 workshops. And the workshops go on all year long around subject disciplines, around issues, how to work with particular populations of kids. We've done lots of work around special needs, working with special needs teachers to do some of the accommodations within the way the performance assessment works that would be particularly helpful to special ed kids. So it's a system that has a lot of layers to it. Just to give you one very specific example, we do these moderation studies of student work. But one year, I think about 4 years ago, in one of the groups, one of the teachers was looking at a paper and said, this is a very good, mediocre paper. And he said, well, what's that mean? Well, it met a lot of the criteria that we were looking for. I mean, it was well structured. It had all of the footnotes. It had, all of the things. The question wasn't very good. The question that the student was working with was really not very interesting. And so we then began to build in to the moderation work, looking at teachers' assignments. And we developed, using Norman Webb's depth of knowledge, a whole way of looking at teacher assignments. Were they challenging? And of course, the better the assignment, the better the quality of the work. And that was very important, so that we're learning constantly about how to look at student work and how to make that a more interesting activity for teachers and for students. So let me say something before I turn it over to the students. Let me just say something about the data that we've collected. We're always updating the data. So this is just to give you a little bit of an idea. There are, so on the graduation, for example, the graduation rate for English language learners it's 30% points higher than the city's graduation rate. The graduation rate for consortiums, special ed students, is double the city's rate. The dropout rate from consortium high schools is half that of other high schools in the system, and the suspension rate is a low 5% compared with 11% for all the New York City high schools and 12% for charters. 93% of the consortium graduates attending four-year colleges persist into their second year. So So we're not looking at what happens at the end of the first year where the big drop-off is. We're really looking.
She didn't hear you.
Is that 9-0?
Yes.
Thank you.
So the national rate is 75% and the New York State rate is 81%. 84% of the students who went to two-year colleges persist into their second year versus the national rate of 54% and the New York State rate of 59%. 86% of the consortium's African American graduating seniors and 90% of the Latino graduating seniors were accepted into colleges versus national rates of 37% and 42%. In terms of teacher turnover, the consortium schools have a 15% teacher turnover rate compared to the New York City rate of 58%. And the charter school rate is difficult to calculate because most of their schools are elementary. We're really talking high schools. But what's out there, at least in terms of discussion numbers, is upwards of 50%, sometimes 60% at the charters. So the indicators are pretty strong that this is there's something going on in these schools. I think that to reduce it, maybe to try to reduce it to one thing, I would say these schools tend to be communities. They tend to have a much stronger culture of inquiry. It's had an enormous impact, just as testing has an enormous impact on, and I think a negative impact on school culture. Performance assessment, this is a teacher-directed, student-focused, and externally assessed system. And I think that it's those three components that make it possible for teachers to develop a sense of collegiality and working through to solve the problems in each school, which are, of course, different depending on what the nature of the school culture is, nature of the school community is. So I think the sense of community among the staff and the students and the parents is very powerful. And I think that has a lot to do with how you can kind of pull all of these things together to make a place that's much more interesting for teachers. I think the retention rate is an indicator of that. The incident rate that's very low is an indicator of the ability of the schools to solve their problems. Many of these schools have restorative justice curriculum and have instituted procedures within their schools. So it has a lot of implications. And we've asked the students that are here to talk a bit about what was the impact that they felt as going on to college. You know, this is the big issue. You know, if you say somebody pointed out the other day that it shouldn't just be college and career. It should be, you know, it's a much broader. We're talking about what's the preparation for life in a democratic society or helping to make a democratic society. Are we really talking about career or are we talking about workforce? You know, there's some very interesting differences that I think we haven't kind of clarified when we have these national debates. But I've asked these students to talk a bit about what was the impact of going to a school that in high school that did not use testing, that used a different approach, and didn't have any effect when they left and went on to college. So I don't know, did you figure out an order or doesn't it matter? Okay. Well, Elliot, you're done. Why don't you start? So Elliot is at Bard, and why don't you speak first?
Hello everyone, my name is Elliot Garcia. I'm a current junior computer science major at Bard College. Just to give a little background, as far as my education, I was one of the few students that actually fell through the cracks when it came to the school system. I wasn't accepted into any of the public high schools in New York City, so they just threw me into one of the toughest high schools in Manhattan, Washington Irving High School. And because of that, you know, I already felt like, you know, I wasn't good enough to be in a good school. And when I went to Washington Irving, it was just complete madness. The teachers, you could tell that their only focus was that, you know, we need to pass the Regents. They drilled that into our heads every single day, in every single class. They made sure that they're only teaching us for these Regents. And when it came time to take the Regents, they were all, like literally all my teachers were shocked because they were like, you know, we didn't teach you anything that was actually on the Regents. So everybody failed. And so that was my freshman year of high school, and then I had transferred to Urban Academy. And it was a bit of a shock because it was quite different from what I was used to. I felt like the teachers actually cared about my education. They cared that they wanted to teach me, and the fact that I was willing to learn. So coming from a high school that traditionally the teachers just speaks to the students more of a lecture-based out way of teaching, and then transferring to another high school where it's discussion-based high school where my opinion mattered. It was different, but it was beneficial because when it came time for writing papers, I always struggled when it came to writing papers. I felt like I was always insulted by teachers about the work that I was bringing in. I felt like I couldn't perform. And I remember the first paper that I had to write in Urban Academy, it was just a simple reflection off of a reading assignment. And I wouldn't hand it in because I felt too ashamed that, I was like my quality of writing wasn't good enough to hand in. But throughout my time, I spent 3 years at Urban Academy, I was able to learn how to write a paper. And, this seems like a simple task, but to be able to write a quality paper that comes from a deep question that you're able to perform your own research on, really attack and analyze whatever it is that you're arguing is a difficult task to achieve. And especially someone who, like me, who had low confidence in his writing and wouldn't often write, it was a big accomplishment for me. And as far as going into college, I remember my freshman year, for my freshman seminar classes, when the professor would tell us, okay, we have a 5 to 7 page paper due as a first paper assignment, I remember everybody freaking out. Like, everybody was like, oh my God, that's too long. How can you assign us 5 pages? We're just freshmen. We're just getting here. And I was, if not the only student who was just like, is there a problem with it? Like, I don't find an issue with it. And I know it's not about the length of the paper, it's more so about the quality of the paper, but the fact that these students who, we all got admitted into this great school, this great liberal arts school, because they saw our I guess, performances that were, good enough for the school. They were freaked out. And, I wouldn't have, if I came from a different high school, I probably would have been just like them, because at that point, I was at their point before where I was scared to write a paper. And if it wasn't for Urban Academy and the performers, the PBACs, we call them proficiencies, I don't think I'd be able to perform well in college. I hated science. I was scared to even think that I had to do a proficiency in science. And then I remember I took a microbiology class and I completely fell in love. For my proficiency in science, I tested whether or not how certain hot sauces affect a microbe, because I did research saying that, if you intake too many spices, it can create a hole in your stomach because it's, tearing down at the bacteria in your stomach. So I tested that. I learned how to do a research paper. I learned how to do a scientific research paper. I did my research, I did the methods, I did a standard research scientific paper, and I did absolutely excellent on it. And if it wasn't for Urban Academy and their teachers who were actually invested in me, invested in my learning, invested in my education, I don't believe I'd be able to do that. Because coming from the high school that I came from, I know what it's like for teachers to give up on their students. And if a teacher gives up on their students, what does a student have to look forward to? Because if they're automatically seen as they're not good enough, or whatever they do isn't good enough, then why perform at all? And if it wasn't for Urban Academy, I wouldn't be in the position that I'm in, because they give me the proper tools to achieve in college, and they give me just simple skills as, approaching a professor. I can easily approach one of my professors and say, I'm confused on how to do this. How do I do this? there are some students who are they tremble at the idea of approaching their professors. And when it comes to computer science, it's more, there are more exams in computer science than any other major. But urban does have exams too that they also teach us how to prepare for exams and what's the proper way to prepare for an exam. And it's helped me out a lot. When it comes to problem solving and all that, I learned to think for myself rather than have a teacher tell me how to think and how I should answer a question. I can look at a question and analyze it, look at it from a critical point of view and break it down as, okay, this is how I solve it, step by step. So here's my answer. If it wasn't for Urban Academy, I don't think I'd be able to do that. So thank you.
So Elliot spoke about a number of the what we call proficiencies and the schools called PBATs. I think just you have there was a handout outside that's a book that has this kind of a cover on it. And if you look in there, instead of taking time to do this now, if you look in there, you'll see what specifically each of the subject discipline requirements are. And there are some examples of some of the kinds of papers and experiments. It requires that students design their own experiment and have to defend it. They all have, each of these has an oral component to it. And they have to defend their idea similar to what a graduate student would do in a PhD. They have to defend it. They're required to do a literary essay and to have that looked at by more than one or two people. And at certain schools, the oral piece of the literary essay is done in different ways. One of the things that Urban does is to actually ask students to select a work of fiction or fiction that they have not studied in a class, read it on their own. And when they feel they're ready, we set them up with an external assessor, somebody they don't know, somebody that has read the book, agreed to read the book, and we've talked to them, trained them. And they have at least an hour-long conversation. They're asked to go with passages prepared to discuss. The person is free to ask them anything. They don't know what the questions are beforehand. And then that person who's the external assessor, they're often a whole Rolodex of people who are writers, professional writers, lawyers, journalists who have agreed to do this. They then debrief with the coordinator of that particular PBAT at the school. And I think that what we're looking for there is to see whether students can negotiate a piece of writing on their own. The book has to be approved. And then be able to really discuss it. And I think once you see that students can do that, you have no worries about whether they can read something when they go on to college and participate in a class. I mean, it just is a very easy, simple, quick, and meaningful way for the school to know whether, when a student is a senior, if they're able to handle that. So in math, they have to apply mathematical concepts to real-life mathematical problems. And in social studies, they have to write a research paper that indicates that they can handle multiple points of view with citations and so on, and again, defend it. So I think what Elliot spoke to was some connections with those particular PBATs.
Suhaila? So hi, I'm Suhaila. I am currently in my second year at Hampshire College. And just Urban Academy was kind of like Hampshire is like a college version of Urban. So it was like nothing changed for me. And I also entered Urban Academy as a freshman, even though it was a transfer school. Going into Urban, I have always been a really good student. I've always done whatever I had to do to get my work done. But taking tests makes me so anxious. Like, I'm a good student, I do my homework, I pay attention in class, I do all that stuff you're supposed to do in class. But taking tests makes me really nervous, I can't focus, I get really distracted, and so that it messes me up. And I went to a public middle school, so I had to take like the standardized tests. But going into Urban and like
speaking with the teachers and taking the classes and learning about going into urban, I didn't think I was going to be able to do the proficiencies. I was like, how does anybody do this? It was like, there's no way I'm going to graduate on time. And I had just like decided that. But working with the teachers and doing specifically the creative arts proficiency helped me to realize that I can take things that I enjoy and things that I like and things that I'm interested in and incorporate them into the requirements that I needed to graduate. So like for my creative arts proficiency, I knew I liked working with children. And I love art, and it's a huge part of my concentration at Hampshire. And so for my creative arts proficiency, I did a series of paintings of the life of a young girl from when she was a baby to when she grew up and was a grandmother. And it like went through the stages of her life. And so, yes, everyone at Urban had to do a creative arts proficiency, but they were specific to who the person was. And I think that's something that I took away from Urban, just incorporating what I love into everything that I do. And, you know, it speaks to the saying, if you do something you love, you won't work a day in your life. And so I took that with me to Hampshire. And going into college in general, like Elliot said, writing 5-page, 7-page papers was nothing for me. And I was able to write papers and read forever because that's what we did at Urban. Urban is structured like college, and Hampshire structured like graduate school. So it was, you know, that's just how that happened. But you know, we had the responsibility at Urban to choose our own classes and really just the freedom and independence to decide what we wanted to do. And coming from a middle school where I was taking standardized tests, I was so anxious. I wasn't aware that I could do the things that I love and still fulfill requirements. Because, you know, taking the standardized tests, I think, creates this assumption that there's a right and wrong answer. You know, there's a right and wrong answer in literature, which doesn't make sense. There's a right and wrong answer in math, but there's still a lot to go into. And with science, there's still a lot to research. And I think that's like the big thing that I took away from Urban, that there's never like a right or wrong answer, that you can always find something else. You can always go deeper. You ask questions and you talk about it. And so specifically going into Hampshire, I didn't feel uncomfortable having discussions with people or saying to the professor, like, well, I hear what you're saying, but I don't necessarily agree. And being able to express my opinion, but also respect someone else's opinion, to like respectfully disagree. I learned how to do that at Urban. And everyone thought, you know, as a 16-year-old that I was mature right beyond my years, and people enjoyed having conversations with me. And really, I just, also Hampshire, I don't know if you guys know this about Hampshire, but Hampshire doesn't have tests. We don't have letter grades. We do narrative evaluations. And they just recently became SAT and ACT blind. So it's very much like not for tests. And in my opinion, taking tests can't tell you who a student is, because students know how to cheat the system, and students also, like me, I'm a terrific student, but I'm horrible at tests. And I think someone said something like, how do you know the students are doing well? It's like, you could always ask them. You know? I mean, like, I don't know why that doesn't cross people's minds, but you could, you know, but conversation and dialogue is a huge part of how we learn things. And if you think of learning as like never ending, you don't stop learning once you leave college or once you leave high school. If you think of learning as never ending, then you can learn through dialogue, and you can learn through conversation and arguments and respectfully defending your opinion and disagreeing with someone else's. And that began at Urban, and I don't think that I would be as confident in what I want to do and who I am, it wasn't.
Sort of underscore a couple of things that Sohaila said. And one is that I think that having teachers be able to teach not to assess means that you can really change the kind of teaching, the kind of instruction, and the kind of curriculum that you use in schools. You can teach in depth. You can spend a lot of time on something that students are really interested in. And I think another point that she made was that it's important to have a passion about, and I think that one of the things that we really don't think enough about with students is how do we help students develop that curiosity and that passion, and they have some, and to take ownership of their learning, of what it is that's important to them. I think those are really key factors in why it is that we fail with so many students, and that it has a lot to do with the kind of environment, the kind of culture that you're creating in the school. I think the consortium schools tend to have cultures of revision. They have cultures of inquiry, and I think those are really fundamental when you're trying to figure out how do you make school a much more interesting, productive place. So, Anne?
Hi, I'm Ana Negron. I'm currently a sophomore at Muhlenberg College. It's in Allentown, Pennsylvania. And just a little background on my school. So Muhlenberg is a liberal arts school. We have about 2,255 students. I only know that because I am a tour guide. So yeah, it's a really small school. And my classes are basically all discussion based. So it's pretty much an urban like little structure college. And part of the reason why I chose Muhlenberg was because of the culture that I experienced at Urban in terms of my relationships with my teachers, in terms of how I learned as a student, and how my teachers were able to accommodate to how I learned, to be quite honest. And I found that opportunity at Muhlenberg, and I took it as soon as possible. And it was the best decision I've made ever to choose such a great school. But I think that part of why I'm having such success in college is because of the things I learned at Urban. And one of the things, I've learned a lot in Urban, and I can honestly say that for the most part, besides math, because math is more, logical and it makes sense and it's straightforward. But everything else is really abstract, even science. And I think that taking all those things into college, how you do look at, as Suhaila said, how there's no real answer to anything, and how you look at different perspectives is what I took into college. And the literature proficiency is what I can say will pinpoint exactly what I benefited the most from. And so basically, as I'm saying, your literature proficiency, you choose a book and you read it and you have a conversation with someone who knows the book as well. And I think that that's amazing. In college, my literature classes and even my social studies classes, I read a lot and I love talking about it. I love drawing random and weird like assumptions and making connections to even my life with these books. And that all came from Urban's literature and even social studies proficiency. Right now, one example, I'm currently in a Black Feminist Thought class, Black Feminist Theory class, and we are reading Patricia Collins' Black Feminist Thought book, which is not a novel necessarily, but it is a book that basically has a lot of key components that I actually drew, not knowingly, drew ideas from that book into my literature proficiency. So I read The Color Purple, and in the dialogue that I had with the person I discussed the book about, we kind of were talking about the significance of The Color Purple and the significance to her life, to Celia. So I was talking about these things in high school, and I felt like, it's just a thing people do at Urban. We just talk about these things. But being in the class I am now, I realized how Urban really drilled a foundation of really analyzing everything that I read. And I drew so many conclusions, so many parallels that I didn't even think that I could with literature, with social studies, with science, with art, even our art criticism proficiency. I'm an art major, I didn't say that. I'm an art major, and I am a Latin American and Caribbean Studies and Africana Studies minor. It's a long thing. But yeah, like urban really helped me channel different interests, and one of them is really history. I never thought I was a history person, because personally I don't like American history, that American textbook history that we learn. I like to learn the things that we don't learn. I like to unpack what we are basically blocked from learning in regular high schools. And I learned that through urban. I learned that we can find the deepest things through a paragraph of literature. We can find anything. And I'm saying this out of all honesty. Like, I say this even as a tour guide to the people who I say I love my high school. I always advocate for my high school. And I say because I do genuinely think that, like, urban and the consortiums, I believe, that really do build foundations for all students of any kind of way. And I actually went to college wanting to be pre-med student, and seeing how I really wasn't, I'm not a good test taker as well. I can't really study. And it's something you learn, of course, but I really can't. I'm very anxious and I don't like it. I even had a professor try to tell me that I should see if I have a disability to see if I had any problems with my test taking. But in fact, it's just because I'm just naturally not. Like, I've learned to learn things the way I want to learn them and the way I accommodate, and that's really analyzing everything. But yeah, I've learned those skills through Urban's proficiencies. I learned those skills through my professors, teachers. I learned those things by just talking. And when it comes to papers, they're amazing to write. When it comes to talking to professors about issues, I have no problem just saying those things, because they can they can testify to the fact that I would love to just tell my teachers all my problems. I complain so much. I would be the one to tell me, you have to bring in your paper, and I'm like, no, not yet, I'm not ready. You know what I mean? It's like things like that that I learned through my high school that I truly appreciate. But yeah.
So I just want to sort of nail 3 points that I think Anna was interesting to talk about. One is the practice issue, that, you know, the way you get to be a good writer is by writing. And so schools need to provide lots of opportunities for kids to write, not 5-paragraph essays, but meaningful papers about meaningful subjects, and to be able to do that again and again. And when we've done some follow-up research on students from the consortium schools, and this is across the schools, we looked at what was it that helped students adjust to college life. What we got back from the graduates over and over again was that there was so much time to practice writing that when we got to college, the stories you're hearing from these students are echoed from the other graduates that have gone from other consortium schools. Secondly, I think that one of the things that happens in these consortium schools, because they're not test-driven, is that student voice becomes important. The kids talk about the importance of discussion. You know, that doesn't happen. If discussion happens in test-driven schools, it's you're going from point A to point B, and there's a point C. And real discussion, meaningful discussion, that's an inquiry-based discussion, doesn't work like that. So I'm hoping Avram will talk a little bit more about that. But I think that's the point that comes through from things that people are saying. And the third thing I want to just point out is that all of them have mentioned skills that are not subject. They're not what we would traditionally call academic skills, you know, not content academic skills. Kids are talking about ability to analyze, the ability to take different points of view and come out with your own point of view. I mean, those are not those are things that have to do with being able, I think Elliot was mentioning, talking to professors, being able to know who to go to ask for help. Those are really critical kinds of skills to have when you go on from high school. And if you don't have those, if you don't know who to go to get help from, or you don't know how to ask a question, or you don't know how to get a professor to explain something to you, you're really operating at a disadvantage. And so I think those are things that most high schools don't think about, and certainly in a test environment, it's much more difficult to allow those kinds of things to develop. So I just want to say that, you know, I think those are points I just want to make sure you hear. Gemma.
I'm Gemma Venuti, and I'm a freshman at College of the Atlantic, majoring in human ecology. I'm concentrating my degree in the sciences, so I've taken a lot of science classes this past year. I've done a total of 2 terms, so 6 classes so far. And so the proficiency that really helped me at Urban was my science proficiency, in which we have to pick a subject that we're interested in, we have to do independent research on it, then we have to create an experiment, we have to carry out the experiment, we have to write a lab report on the experiment, and then we have to defend our work in front of an outside examiner. The things that the science proficiency really helped me with were independent research, how to move on from mistakes I make in my work, how to manage my time, how to write lab reports, how to go to teachers for help, and how to give presentations. The bit about how to move on from mistakes in my work was huge, because I made a huge mistake in my experiment when I first started it. My question was, how does fear affect memory? And I realized that I couldn't actually scare the people that I was so I had to completely revise my questions so that the work made sense. So I revised it to, how does stress affect memory? And it was a whole process of revision. I didn't have to throw out any of my research. I didn't have to recreate my experiment. Instead, I just went to my teacher for help, and I asked, what can I do? And she said, well, just come up with a bunch of other questions that you think that your work relates to, and then you can do minor revisions after that so that your question does make sense. And that's what I did, and that's what ended up happening. And in college, I made a couple mistakes with my work too, and I know that is completely fine. And I've just gone to my teachers for help, which I wouldn't be able to do the work I do in college without doing that. I've had to do presentations in a lot of my classes. So last term I took Biology 1 and a History of Natural History, both classes I had to do presentations in. In Biology 1, I did a presentation on archaea, which are prokaryote organisms, and why they can live in such extreme conditions. And it was really confusing stuff. I hadn't really taken a biology class before college, so I was kind of at a disadvantage. I didn't really know any of the basic chemistry. I didn't really know a lot of the basics that I was learning about. So, but it didn't really matter because I knew how to do the independent research from Urban, and I found that I actually wasn't really behind a lot of the other kids in my class because I had all these skills I had learned from high school. The other thing was that the project on archaea was an independent project. It was related to the class, but it wasn't something that we were lectured on in class. It was pick a topic and then learn about it, and then you have to present on it at the end of class. And so there's a lot of time management involved in that. Another thing about COA is that the terms are only 10 weeks, so we only have 10 weeks to do what we would normally do in a whole half a year. So we have a lot less time. And with proficiencies at Urban, we have to decide on our time ourselves. So the only real deadline we have is your proficiency needs to be done at the end of the semester. So we have to decide how long our independent research is going to take. We have to decide how long we're going to take to do our experiments and all of those things. So that really helped with the 10-week terms, because instead of doing all my independent research in 9 weeks and then only having 2 days to meet up with my project partners and do the rest of it, I was able to space those things out so I had enough time for everything. Yeah.
So I want to two things that came through here is, one is perseverance. And I think that very often what happens in schools is that, kids get assignments that don't matter very much, so they kind of do them. And then when they have to do something that's sustained, it requires going back and trying to retrace your steps or reframe the question. They haven't had much experience with that. So I think that the example of the science experiment and the science PBAC is a very interesting one from that point of view. And also the flexibility that you learn from trying something out that doesn't quite go the way you think it's going to go and having to kind of regroup. So I think there's a lot of threads here, and I'm going to ask Avram to talk about what it's like to be a teacher in a situation where your curriculum and your whole kind of professional career is not bound up with a state exam.
Okay, my name is Avram Barlow. I've been at the Urban Academy since its founding. I've worked with a number of the other schools in the consortium. I'll talk a little bit here about what it means to be a teacher at a school like this. I think that first of all, it's exciting and it's interesting. And I always say, if you're not learning all the time as a teacher, then I don't know how effective you are being as a teacher. You're learning from the demands made by the students and the role that they play in the school and in the curriculum. I think you're first of all, in order to really effectively get kids to do these performance assessments, you have to teach differently. So you're learning how to ask open-ended questions. You're learning how to ask good questions. You're learning how to take ideas that students put forth in a classroom and turn them into questions. You're learning how to listen to kids. Because running discussions and running the classroom really requires you to think about what their ideas are as they're coming out and how you want kids to hear each other's ideas. You're a facilitator of discussion, so you really have to learn how to listen to students in the classroom. You have to figure out ways, as I said, of making students' ideas a central part of what's happening in the classroom. You may come to class with a series of questions that you want to ask. But incorporating their questions and their ideas into the so-called lesson plan, that's a crucial skill. It's a very different experience. It takes time to learn how to do that. You're putting a priority on depth as opposed to coverage. And I can talk about that in terms of the curriculum, which is also very different. The teachers in our school create the curriculum. We sit around in the social studies department every semester and we say, what's the range of courses we want to offer, and what are we passionate about teaching and what do we want to teach? I teach different things every term. This semester I'm teaching and partly co-teaching 3 courses. I teach a semester-long course on the Civil War and Reconstruction. One of the things you do in an American history course is you don't teach a survey course. And so you say, and kids who are interested in that course sign up for it. So you spend from September till the end of January, right? You spend that whole time on that period of history. So I teach a Civil War Reconstruction course. I'm teaching another course that the students are calling Retro Pop, but it's really a way of looking at 20th century history and the issue of gender, race, ethnic, class, identity through the prism of popular culture. So starting with Birth of a Nation, looking at the perils of Pauline, looking at silent film initially, and constantly and in the context of what's happening in terms of World War I, the Great Migration, the 1920s industrialization, etc. That's the second course I teach. And then we created a course this semester based on a book that the New York Times reporter Bob Herbert wrote called Losing Our Way. I don't know if anyone's heard of this book. Bob Herbert was a New York Times reporter who's basically left his job at the New York Times and spent 2 years traveling the country and talking to people who were struggling with the fallout of our economy, and looks at education, returning veterans, the jobs issue. And we felt that kids are coming out of college and high school now into a world that's a little bit, that's actually substantially different in some significant ways from what it was 10 years ago in terms of work and opportunity. And we wanted the chance for kids to grapple with that through a book that has some very grim news, but figuring out a way to bring students' vision of themselves and their hopes and their aspirations to what the reality is in America, and have them struggle with that. That's an entire course, entire semester. So that the curriculum is different, and what you can do is different. Although there is an American history course, but it's emphasizing depth. And to which I want to say about that, I want to give you an example of how that works within the framework of a classroom, right? So we also teach a course, and it's a course I inherited co-teaching with Anne. We've been doing this for 25 years in the history of the civil rights movement. It's usually a semester-long course. Last year it was a year-long course. Just to give you an example of how the pedagogy differs and how depth plays a role. The course usually begins with in 1941 with the March on a civil rights march on Washington that never happened, and we try to get through the mid-60s, in a semester. And we were looking at the integration of Major League Baseball, and we had looked at the movie 42 about Jackie Robinson. We were looking at a host of primary and secondary sources, and in the course of talking about Jackie Robinson's experience, a kid raised his hand and said, there were these Negro Leagues. Maybe they should have brought a whole all-black team into the major leagues instead of an individual player, right? And there was a huge discussion about whether that could have worked, whether that was feasible, and it was clear that the entire class was very interested in all of that. So we spent 2 weeks on the Negro Leagues. And what they looked like, and what their relationship was to other businesses in the black community, and how they did, and who went to those games, and argued about various dimensions of all of that. And that meant that we didn't get to Selma this semester. It meant that and the fact is that the depths in which we went to that was extremely valuable for us, and I learned a tremendous amount from that. Kids will raise questions that require teachers to go out and bring resources and people to bear in the classroom that teachers should be learning from. It's a very different experience, I think, than when you're teaching to a test. In general, the school really becomes, for the teacher, a problem-solving community. So once a week at our school, all of our kids go out into New York City and for 3 hours at 70 or 80 different placements, and they do community service work. In that 3-hour window each week, our staff sits around a table and does problem solving. And 99% of decisions made at that school are made around that table by that staff in terms of policy, curriculum, so that our staff collectively creates a school schedule every year. Collaboratively, we program every kid in the school as a staff, collectively. We look at each other's work. People present problems that they're struggling with in a classroom. They present student work. They present lessons, and it gets discussed there, right? We mentor new teachers. We have our own internal evaluation system for each other that we control, and that meeting plays a central role in. And of course, we talk about kids. We sit around a table and we talk about students and issues that they're working on and struggling with. And also, many of us play a role within the consortium and are involved in working with other schools and representing the school politically and traveling to events like this. So it's a really interesting life as a teacher. You're constantly involved, and you're growing, and you're learning, and you're problem solving with other people. And it's really the kind of experience that we would like to see in more places and more teachers and students have together.
So I hope that we can continue this kind of conversation in the workshop.
Thank you so much. We're running just a few minutes late. The workshops will go the full length. We'll start lunch just a few minutes late. We'll adjust as the day goes on. There's only about 40 of us here, it turns out, so it may be 50. We'll adjust. It's not a big crew. We won't have any real trouble. But we have a proposal here for the workshops, and Paul is going to explain how we will now make some adjustments in the workshop schedule given our numbers.
Yeah. So thanks very much for the presentation. We're going to change up the day a little bit. So all of the workshops that we're going to present twice that you see on the schedule here are now going to be in the afternoon session. And we're also going to move that afternoon session up. So right after lunch, where we have the open space technology piece, we're just going to go straight into the second set of workshops there. So it's going to be workshop, lunch, workshop, and then those who want to come together and gather at the end to do open space, including a discussion of advocacy around affecting policy around testing. We'll do that after the second set of workshops. But for now, if you have I don't know if you have a pen, let me just tell you that the workshops that will go on here in session 1 are first the New York Performance Standards Consortium up in the library on the second floor. What did you say?
Yes, there's heating upstairs.
Yeah, this is the only unheated room in the place. Second is Boston Day and Evening Academy. Will be in room 210, as it says here. Chelsea High School in room 215. That's the capstone project. And the Boston Public Schools Science Department in room 211. So those are the 4 morning sessions. And then in the afternoon, the afternoon will be the bottom 4 sessions on your schedule. So Arts Academy, One Dorchester, Young Achievers School, and Upstander Project. Those will be the afternoon sessions that will take place at 1 o'clock instead of
And a continuation is Paul and Urban again?
We'll figure that out.
Okay.
So for now, just to repeat, is New York Performance Standards in the library, Boston Day and Evening in 210, Chelsea in 215, BPS Science in 211, and then we'll come down to lunch after that.
Which is also heated.
Yeah, all heated except for this.
I don't